A steamy summer night. A forbidden attraction. Emma can't resist the temptation to watch her brother Jake in the shower, but when he catches her, the line between curiosity and desire blurs. What starts as a dangerous game quickly spirals into a passionate affair, filled with secret encounters and stolen moments. But when their mother walks in, everything changes. She knows their secret, and she has a confession of her own. As tensions rise and emotions run high, Emma and Jake must decide how far they're willing to go for love. Will their forbidden passion destroy their family, or will it bring them closer than ever? Stay with us to find out how this taboo love story unfolds, and don't forget to subscribe. The summer heat clung to the air like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. Tonight, Emma thought is going to be different. She lingered at the edge of the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cool wooden floor. The house was quiet, too quiet, but she could hear the faint hum of the shower running down the hall. Her brother's shower. Her pulse quickened, a forbidden thrill coursing through her veins. "This is wrong," a voice in her head whispered, but it was drowned out by the louder, more insistent one that said, "Just once. Just to see." She crept closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The door to the bathroom was cracked open, just enough to let the steam escape and carry the scent of his body wash into the hallway. Emma hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What if he catches me? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but it wasn't fear, it was excitement. She leaned in, her breath catching as she peered through the narrow gap. The fogged-up mirror obscured most of the room, but she could see enough. Her brother, Jake, stood under the stream of water, his back to her. His broad shoulders glistened with droplets, his muscles taut as he ran his hands through his wet hair. Emma felt her cheeks flush, her body reacting to the sight in ways she didn't want to admit. Stop this, she told herself, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her eyes refusing to look away. Jake shifted, turning slightly, and Emma's breath hitched. His chest was just as sculpted as his back, water cascading down his skin in rivulets. Her gaze traveled lower, her pulse quickening as she caught a glimpse of his hips, the edge of his arousal barely visible through the steam. God, he's perfect, she thought, her own body betraying her with a warmth that pooled low in her belly. She couldn't stop herself. Her hand reached out, pushing the door open just a fraction more, the creak of the hinges barely audible over the sound of the water. One more second, she told herself, just one more look. But as she leaned in, Jake's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers through the steam. "Emma?" His voice was low, rough, and it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Shit. 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 She should have run, should have bolted back to her room and pretended this never happened. But instead, she stayed rooted to the spot, her lips parting as if to speak but no words coming out. Jake didn't move to cover himself, didn't even seem embarrassed. Instead, he just watched her, his gaze dark and unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until finally he spoke again. "What are you doing?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a challenge that made her stomach twist. Emma's voice trembled, her mind racing for an excuse, but she came up empty. "There's no way to explain this." She swallowed hard, her cheeks burning. I don't know." Jake stepped out of the shower, water dripping from his body as he reached for a towel. Emma's eyes widened, her breath catching as he wrapped it around his waist, his movements slow and deliberate. He moved closer, until he was standing right in front of her, his damp skin radiating heat. "You don't know?" he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, sending a shiver down her spine. Emma couldn't look away, her body trembling under his gaze. I wanted to see," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's lips curved into a smirk, but there was something dangerous in his eyes. "See what?" She felt her face flush even hotter, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "This is so wrong," she thought, but her body was betraying her, her nipples hardening under the thin fabric of her nightshirt. "You," she breathed, her voice trembling. Jake's smirk widened, and he took another step closer, until she could feel the heat of his body against hers. "And what did you see, Emma?" he murmured, his voice like velvet. She hesitated, her mind racing. "What am I doing?" But the words spilled out before she could stop them. "I saw how perfect you are." Jake's eyes darkened, and he reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Emma's breath hitched, her body melting under his touch. "You think I'm perfect?" he asked, his voice low and teasing. She nodded, her lips parting as his thumb brushed over her bottom lip. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "Then why don't you touch me?" Emma's eyes widened, her heart skipping a beat. This is insane. But she couldn't stop herself. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his chest. His skin was hot, slick with water, and she felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her at the contact. Jake's breath hitched, and he caught her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. "Not like that," he murmured, his voice rough. "Touch me like you mean it." Emma's pulse raced, her body aching with a need she couldn't ignore. She hesitated for only a second before she pressed her hand against his chest, her fingers splaying across his skin. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, steady and strong, and it only made her want him more. Jake's eyes locked onto hers, dark and intense. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. Emma's breath caught, her body trembling as he leaned in closer, his lips brushing against hers in a whisper of a kiss. She froze, her mind screaming at her to pull away, but her body was already betraying her, leaning into him, wanting more. Jake's hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair as he deepened the kiss. Emma's eyes fluttered shut, a moan escaping her lips as she melted into him. "This is wrong," her mind screamed, but her body didn't care, her hands sliding down his chest, desperate to feel more of him. Jake's other hand gripped her hip, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed together. Emma could feel his arousal through the thin towel, and it only made her ache for more. Her fingers tugged at the edge of the towel, her breath hitching as it slipped down, revealing the hard length of him. "Jake," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You started this, Emma," he murmured, his lips brushing against hers. "Are you going to finish it?" Jake's grip on Emma's wrist was firm but not painful as he led her down the hallway, his towel still precariously hanging low on his hips. The only sound was the soft padding of her bare feet against the wooden floor and the faint rhythm of their breathing, heavier than usual. He didn't look back at her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, the tension in his muscles as he kept her close. His bedroom door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, pulling her inside with him. The click of the lock echoed in the quiet room, sealing them in together. Emma's heart thundered in her chest, her pulse racing as she glanced around the familiar space. It was the same room she'd seen 1,000 times, but now it felt foreign, charged with something dangerous and electric. Jake's presence filled the room, his scent, musky and clean from the shower, overwhelming her senses. He turned to face her, his dark eyes locked on hers. The corner of his mouth twitched, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Nervous?" he asked, his voice low and rough, the kind of tone that made her stomach clench. Emma swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. "A little," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake took a step closer, his chest nearly brushing against hers. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her flushed skin. "Don't be," he murmured. "You wanted this, didn't you? You wouldn't have been watching me otherwise." Her breath hitched, cheeks burning as she recalled the moment he'd caught her. I don't know what I was thinking," she stammered, her voice shaky. Jake chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Yes, you do," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're curious, Emma. You've always been curious about me. And now you don't have to just wonder. You can know." Her lips parted, a small gasp escaping as his words settled over her. He was right. She had wondered, fantasized even, but she'd never dared to imagine it could actually happen. Her body ached just thinking about it, and the way he was looking at her, so intense, so sure of himself, made her feel like she was coming undone. Jake's hand slid from her cheek down to her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "Tell me what you want, Emma," he said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Tell me and I'll give it to you." Her eyes flickered, her mind racing. She wanted so much, but the words felt stuck in her throat, tangled up in guilt and desire. Finally, she managed to whisper, "I want you." Jake's smirk deepened, a flicker of something dark and hungry in his eyes. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice dripping with approval. His hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her into a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was possessive, demanding, and Emma's knees nearly buckled under the force of it. Her hands found his chest, her fingers splaying over the firm muscle there as she kissed him back, her hesitation melting away. Jake's other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flesh against him until she could feel every inch of his body against hers. The towel fell away somewhere between the door and the bed, but Emma barely noticed. All she could focus on was him, the heat of his skin, the way his lips moved against hers, the way his hands explored her body with a confidence that left her breathless. Jake broke the kiss just long enough to pull her shirt over her head, tossing it aside before his lips found hers again. His hands moved to the waistband of her shorts, deftly undoing the button and sliding them down her legs. Emma stepped out of them, her body trembling as he guided her backward until the backs of her knees hit the edge of the bed. She sat down, her breath coming in shallow gasps as Jake knelt in front of her, his hands sliding up her thighs. "Tell me if you want me to stop," he said, his voice low and rough, his breath warm against her skin. Emma nodded, though she knew she wouldn't. She couldn't. Not now. His lips pressed against her inner thigh, and she let out a soft moan, her fingers tangling in the sheets. His tongue trailed higher, and she gasped, her hips lifting off the bed slightly. "Jake," she whimpered, her voice trembling. He didn't stop, his mouth finding the most sensitive part of her, and Emma's head fell back, a low moan escaping her lips. Her hands gripped the sheets as pleasure washed over her body arching toward him. It was too much and not enough all at once, and she could feel herself teetering on the edge. "That's it, Emma," Jake murmured against her skin, his voice thick with desire. "Let go." Her breathing quickened, her body tensing as the pressure built inside her. And then, with a cry, she came undone, her body shuddering as waves of pleasure rolled through her. Jake's hands gripped her hips, holding her steady as she rode out the sensation, her moans filling the room. When she finally came down, her body limp and trembling, Jake moved up to lie beside her, propping himself up on one elbow. His other hand brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his eyes dark with desire. "Feel good?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Emma nodded, still catching her breath. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jake smirked, leaning down to kiss her again, this one softer, almost tender. "Good," he said against her lips. "Because we're just getting started." Emma's heart skipped, her body already responding to his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jake's hand slid down her body, his fingers brushing against her hip before moving lower. "You said you wanted me," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "And I'm going to give you everything." Emma's breath hitched as his fingers found her again, teasing her gently. Her eyes fluttered shut, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling with need. "Tell me how bad you want it," he said, his voice low and commanding, his fingers still moving torturously slow. Emma's hips lifted slightly, her body begging for more. "Please," she whimpered, her voice breaking. Jake's lips curved into a dangerous smile. "That's not good enough, Emma," he said, his tone teasing but firm. "Tell me exactly what you want me to do to you." She hesitated, her cheeks burning, but the way he was looking at her, so intense, so hungry, made the words spill out before she could stop them. "I want you inside me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake's eyes darkened, a low growl escaping his throat. "Good girl," he said, his voice rough with desire. He shifted over her, his body pressing her into the mattress as he positioned himself between her legs. His hand gripped her hip, holding her firmly as he leaned down to kiss her, his lips claiming hers with a possessiveness that left her breathless. Emma's hand slid up his back, her fingers digging into his skin as she felt him press against her. "Jake," she gasped, her body trembling with anticipation. He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "Last chance to say no," he murmured, his voice low and husky. Emma shook her head, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling with need. Jake's lips curved into a dangerous smile. "Your wish is my command," he said, his voice rough with desire. And then he pushed into her, filling her completely, and Emma let out a cry, her body arching against his. Her nails dug into his back as he began to move, setting a pace that was both punishing and somehow tender. Each thrust sent waves of pleasure through her body responding to him instinctively. Her moans filled the room, mingling with the sound of their ragged breathing and the soft creak of the bed. "That's it, Emma," Jake murmured against her ear, his voice thick with desire. "Let go. I've got you." Emma's hand slid up to grip his shoulders, her body moving with his as the pressure built inside her once again. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her moans growing louder as he drove her closer to the edge. And then, with a cry, she fell apart, her body shuddering as waves of pleasure rolled through her. Jake's grip on her hips tightened as he followed her over the edge, his body stiffening as he found his release. He collapsed onto her, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, they just lay there, their bodies still intertwined, their hearts racing in unison. Finally, Jake rolled onto his side, pulling her with him so that she was tucked against his chest. His hand stroked her hair gently, his breathing slowly returning to normal. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice soft. Emma hesitated, her mind still reeling. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I don't regret it." Jake's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good," he said, his voice low and rough. "Because this is just the beginning, Emma. I'm not done with you yet." Her eyes widened slightly, her body responding to his words even as her mind struggled to process them. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake's hand slid down her back, his fingers tracing the curve of her spine. "You'll see," he murmured, his voice dripping with promise. "But first, I need you to do something for me." Emma's breath hitched, her heart pounding. "What?" she whispered. Jake's lips brushed against her ear, his voice low and rough. "Turn over," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, rolling onto her stomach as Jake positioned himself behind her. His hands gripped her hips, pulling her back against him, and Emma's breath caught as she felt him press against her once again. "Jake," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Sure," he murmured, his hands moving over her body. "Just relax, Emma. I'll take care of you." Her fingers gripped the sheets, her body trembling with anticipation as he entered her once again, setting a pace that was both punishing and impossibly tender. Emma's moans filled the room, her body responding to him instinctively as he drove her closer to the edge. "Jake," she whimpered, her voice trembling with need. "That's it, Emma," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "Let go. I've got you." Emma's breath hitched as Jake's thrusts grew harder, faster, her body arching off the bed as she clung to him. The room was thick with the sound of their ragged breathing, the heat between them unbearable and intoxicating. She could feel the pressure building, that sweet, unbearable tension coiling in her core, threatening to snap at any moment. Jake's hand slid up her thigh, gripping her hip hard enough to leave marks, and she whimpered, her fingers digging into his shoulders. "I'm so close," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Shake, I'm..." Before she could finish, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the front door echoed through the house. Emma froze, her eyes widening in panic. Jake stopped mid-thrust, his body tensing as he listened. Footsteps. Their mother's voice. "Emma? Jake." She called out, her voice carrying up the stairs. "Are you home?" Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're going to get caught." Jake's grip on her hip tightened, his expression darkening with a mix of frustration and amusement. "Stay quiet," he murmured, his voice low and commanding. He didn't pull away, didn't stop. Instead, he leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "Don't you dare make a sound." Emma's breath caught as he began to move again, the slow, deliberate strokes sending waves of pleasure through her body. She bit her lip to stifle a moan, her nails digging into his back. The fear of being caught only heightened the intensity, her body trembling as she tried to stay silent. The footsteps grew louder, followed by the creak of the staircase, as their mother made her way up. Emma's eyes widened, panic and arousal warring inside her. "Jake," she whispered, her voice shaking. "She's coming." Jake's lips curved into a smirk, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Then you'd better not scream," he murmured, his thrusts growing harder, faster. Emma's body arched, a strangled moan escaping her lips as she tried to stay quiet. She could hear their mother's footsteps in the hallway now, just outside the door. Her heart pounded, her body trembling with a mix of fear and pleasure. "Emma?" Their mother's voice was close, too close. "Are you in there?" Jake's hand clamped over her mouth, his thrusts relentless, driving her closer and closer to the edge. Emma's eyes fluttered shut, her body writhing beneath him as he pushed her over, the pleasure overwhelming her senses. The door handle rattled. "Jake," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "She's going to." The door creaked open. Jake rolled off her in one fluid motion, pulling the sheets up to cover them both just as the door swung open. Their mother stood in the doorway, her brow furrowed as she looked at them. "What's going on in here?" she asked, her tone sharp. Jake propped himself up on one elbow, his expression calm and collected. "Just taking a nap," he said casually, his voice steady. "What's up, Mom?" Their mother's eyes flicked between them, her frown deepening. Emma's heart was still racing, her body trembling beneath the sheets. She forced herself to stay still, to keep her breathing even, but every nerve in her body was alight with fear and arousal. "It's the middle of the day," their mother said, her arms crossed. "What are you two doing in bed together?" Jake shrugged, his expression nonchalant. "We were tired. It's hot outside. What's the big deal?" Their mother's eyes narrowed, but she didn't press further. "Well, get up. I need help with the groceries." "Sure thing," Jake said, his tone casual. "We'll be down in a minute." Their mother hesitated for a moment longer before finally turning and leaving the room, closing the door behind her. Emma let out a shaky breath, her body still trembling. "That was too close," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake chuckled, his hand sliding under the sheets to trace the curve of her hip. "You're welcome," he murmured, his voice low and teasing. Emma's breath hitched as his fingers trailed lower, her body still tingling from their near miss. "Jake," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "We can't." Jake's lips curved into a smirk as he leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. "Can't we?" he murmured, his fingers slipping between her thighs. "You're still wet, Emma." Emma's breath caught, her body responding to his touch despite her better judgment. "She's still downstairs," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake's smirk widened as he shifted, his body pressing against hers. "Then you'd better be quiet," he murmured, his lips brushing against her neck. Emma's eyes fluttered shut, her body arching into his as he began to move again, his thrust slow and deliberate. She bit her lip to stifle a moan, her nails digging into the sheets as he pushed her closer and closer to the edge. "Jake," she breathed, her voice trembling. "We can't." Jake's hand clamped over her mouth again, his thrusts growing harder, faster. "Don't scream," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. Emma's body was on fire, every nerve alight with pleasure as he pushed her over the edge, her vision blurring as she came, her body trembling beneath him. Jake's movements grew more erratic, his breathing ragged as he followed her over the edge, his body shuddering with release. They lay there for a moment, both of them breathing hard, their bodies still pressed together. Jake's hand slid away from her mouth, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "You're playing a dangerous game, Emma," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. Emma's breath hitched, her heart still racing. "So are you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake chuckled, his lips brushing against her neck. "And I'm just getting started." Downstairs, their mother called out again. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning struggling against the sweltering summer heat. Emma's bare feet padded across the hardwood floor, her heart pounding with every step. She glanced over her shoulder, straining to listen for any sign of movement downstairs. Her mother was still in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes faint but steady. Safe, she thought, though the word did little to calm her nerves. Her hand trembled as she twisted the doorknob to Jake's room, pushing it open just enough to slip inside. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Jake was sprawled on his bed, shirtless, his muscles relaxed but still commanding. He propped himself up on one elbow, his dark eyes locking onto hers as she hesitated by the door. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" he teased, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Emma's cheeks flushed, but she didn't retreat. No, she thought, not this time. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the latch felt final, sealing her decision. She crossed the room, her legs feeling unsteady, until she stood at the edge of the bed. Jake's gaze never wavered, his expression a mix of amusement and something darker, more dangerous. "I thought," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe we could again." Jake's lips curved into a smirk. "You're insatiable," he said, reaching out to brush his fingers along her arm. "I like that." Emma's breath hitched at his touch, the warmth of his skin sparking something deep within her. She climbed onto the bed, her knees sinking into the soft mattress as she straddled him. His hands immediately found her hips, his grip firm as if daring her to pull away. But she didn't. She leaned down, her lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened into something more. Jake's hands slid up her back, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. His tongue teased hers, his movements deliberate and commanding. Emma moaned softly, her body melting against his as the tension between them crackled like a live wire. "Tell me what you want," he murmured against her lips, his voice rough with desire. Emma hesitated, her cheeks burning. "I want you," she whispered, the words feeling forbidden even as they left her lips. Jake chuckled, a low, throaty sound that made her heart race. "Good girl," he said, his hands sliding down to her thighs. "Let's see if you can keep up." He rolled them over, pinning her beneath him with ease. Emma's breath caught as he kissed her neck, his teeth grazing her skin in a way that made her shiver. His hands roamed over her body, exploring every inch, as if memorizing her. She arched into his touch, her fingers tangling in his hair as he trailed kisses down her chest. When he reached the hem of her shirt, he paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Off," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Emma hesitated for only a moment before obediently pulling her shirt over her head. Jake's gaze darkened as he took her in, his hands skimming over her bare skin. "Beautiful," he murmured, his voice heavy with approval. His lips found hers again, this time more demanding, more urgent. Emma's hands roamed over his chest, her fingertips tracing the contours of his muscles. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, steady and strong, and it made her own pulse quicken. Jake's hands moved to her waist, his fingers deftly undoing the button of her jeans. He slid them down her legs, tossing them aside before kissing his way back up her body. His lips lingered at her inner thigh, his breath warm against her skin. Emma's stomach tightened with anticipation, her hips instinctively arching toward him. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Sure," he murmured, his lips brushing against her. "Let me take care of you." His tongue flicked against her, and Emma gasped, her hands clutching the sheets as waves of pleasure washed over her. Jake's movements were slow and deliberate, his tongue exploring every inch of her with a practiced ease that left her breathless. She moaned, her hips moving in time with his rhythm, her body trembling with need. "You taste so good," he growled, his voice muffled against her. "I could do this all day." Emma whimpered, her nails digging into the mattress as the tension inside her coiled tighter and tighter. "Jake, please," she begged, her voice barely audible. He pulled back, his eyes locking onto hers as he positioned himself above her. "You sure?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Emma nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with longing. Jake kissed her deeply, his body pressing against hers as he entered her in one smooth motion. Emma gasped, her legs wrapping around him as he began to move. His rhythm was steady, his thrusts deep and deliberate, each one sending shockwaves of pleasure through her. "You feel so tight," he groaned, his forehead resting against hers. "So fucking perfect." Emma's hands roamed over his back, her nails leaving faint trails as she clung to him. She could feel the heat building inside her, the tension coiling tighter and tighter with every thrust. Jake's lips found hers again, his kisses hungry and demanding, stealing her breath as they moved together. "I'm close," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake's grip tightened on her hips, his movements becoming more urgent. "Let go," he commanded, his voice rough with need. "Come for me, Emma." The words were enough to send her over the edge, her body trembling as pleasure crashed over her in waves. Jake followed soon after, his release mingling with hers as they collapsed together, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. For a moment, they lay there in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jake brushed a strand of hair from Emma's face, his expression unreadable. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly. Emma's lips curved into a shy smile. "Maybe," she whispered, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "But you're the one who started this." Jake chuckled, the sound warm and deep. "And I'm not stopping," he said, his eyes darkening with promise. "Not anytime soon." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she lay tangled in Jake's sheets, their bodies still warm from the heat of their forbidden encounter. The room was thick with the scent of their lust, the air heavy and unyielding. She could still feel the ghost of his hands on her skin, her body trembling with the aftershocks of pleasure. Jake's breathing was ragged beside her, his arm draped possessively over her waist, his fingers trailing lazy circles on her hip. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the kitchen appliances, a reminder that their mother was still downstairs. "Do you think she heard us?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned her head to look at Jake, her wide eyes searching his for reassurance. Jake smirked, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. "If she did, she'd have stormed in here by now," he said, his voice low and confident. "Relax, Emma. We're fine." But Emma couldn't relax. Her mind was racing, her nerves on edge. The thrill of what they had just done, what they had been doing, was still coursing through her veins, but so was the fear of getting caught. She glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Her mother's sharp eyes and stern voice loomed in her imagination like a specter. "Jake," she started, her voice trembling. "What if she comes up here? What if she—" Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps on the stairs made her freeze. Her eyes widened in panic, and she instinctively pulled the sheet up to cover herself. Jake sat up, his expression turning serious as he listened. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside his bedroom door. "Jake? Emma?" Their mother's voice was calm but firm, cutting through the silence like a knife. Emma's breath hitched, and she looked at Jake with sheer terror in her eyes. "Oh my God," she mouthed silently, her body trembling. Jake's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. He grabbed his shirt from the floor and quickly pulled it on, then tossed Emma her dress. "Get dressed," he whispered urgently. "Now." Emma scrambled to obey, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the fabric. She barely had time to pull the dress over her head before the door creaked open. Their mother stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She was dressed in her usual business attire, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. Her gaze flicked from Jake to Emma, taking in their disheveled appearances, the rumpled sheets, the flushed faces. The room seemed to grow colder as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone deceptively calm. Emma's mind raced, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of her mother's scrutiny, the way her eyes seemed to see right through her. She looked at Jake, silently pleading for him to say something, anything, to get them out of this. Jake cleared his throat, his voice steady. "We were just talking," he said, his tone casual. "Emma had a bad dream, and she came in here to talk about it." Their mother raised an eyebrow, her lips pursed in a thin line. "Talking," she repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Emma's face burned with shame, and she looked down at her hands, unable to meet her mother's gaze. She could feel the tension in the room thickening, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Jake hesitated, his usual confidence wavering under their mother's stern gaze. "Mom, it's not what you think," he started, but she cut him off. "Don't insult my intelligence, Jake," she said sharply, her voice like steel. "I'm not blind. I know what's been going on between you two." Emma's heart sank, and she felt like she might be sick. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This was it, they were caught. There was no way out of this. Their mother stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She stopped at the edge of the bed, looking down at them with an expression that was impossible to read. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze shifting between them. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Do you think I don't know what it's like?" she asked. Her voice softer now, almost wistful. Emma frowned, confused. She glanced at Jake, who looked just as bewildered. "What do you mean?" she asked tentatively. Their mother's lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "Do you think I never felt the way you feel?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I never wanted something forbidden?" Emma's eyes widened, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. She looked at Jake, who seemed just as stunned, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Their mother took a deep breath, her expression softening as she looked at them. "I've seen the way you look at each other," she said, her voice gentle now. "I've felt the tension between you. And I know how hard it is to resist that kind of desire." Emma's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This had to be some kind of dream, a twisted, surreal nightmare. But it wasn't. It was real. Her mother was standing in front of her, confessing something. Something Emma didn't fully understand. "Mom," Jake started, his voice hoarse. "What are you saying?" Their mother looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else, something Emma couldn't quite place. "I'm saying that I know what it's like," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "And I'm saying, I understand." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Emma's mind was reeling, her thoughts a jumbled mess. She didn't know what to say, what to think. Her mother, her strict, no-nonsense mother, was standing there, confessing to what? Understanding? Wanting? Emma didn't know where this was going, but she could feel the shift in the room, the tension growing thicker, more electric. Her mother took a step closer, her eyes locking onto Emma's. "I've always known, Emma," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"I've always known how you feel about him."
"And I've always known how he feels about you." Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. She could feel Jake's eyes on her, could sense his confusion, but she couldn't look at him. All she could do was stare at her mother, her heart pounding in her chest. Their mother reached out, her fingers brushing against Emma's cheek. The touch was soft, almost tender, but it sent a shiver down Emma's spine. "You're not alone," her mother murmured, her voice barely audible. "You're not the only one who's felt this way." Emma's mind was spinning, her body trembling with a mix of fear and something else, something she didn't want to name. She looked at Jake, her eyes wide with panic and confusion. He looked just as lost, his usual confidence shattered. Their mother's hand lingered on Emma's cheek for a moment longer before she pulled away. She turned to Jake, her expression softening even more. "I've seen the way you look at her," she said, her voice gentle. "The way you touch her. And I know how much you want her." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at their mother, his eyes filled with a mix of shock and something else, something darker. Their mother took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in front of her. "I'm not going to pretend that this is normal," she said, her voice trembling now. "But I'm not going to punish you for it either. Because I understand. More than you know." Emma felt like she was going to pass out. Her head was spinning, her body trembling with a mix of fear and something else. Something she didn't want to name. She looked at Jake, silently pleading for him to say something, anything, to make sense of this. But Jake didn't say anything. He just stared at their mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something else. Something darker. Their mother took a step closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his face. The touch was soft, almost tender, but it made Jake flinch. "I've always known," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've always known how much you want her." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't pull away. He just stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something else, something darker. Their mother's hand lingered on his cheek for a moment longer before she pulled away. She turned to Emma, her expression softening even more. "I've seen the way you look at him," she said, her voice gentle. "The way you touch him. And I know how much you want him." Emma's mind was spinning, her body trembling with a mix of fear and something else, something she didn't want to name. She looked at Jake, silently pleading for him to say something, anything, to make sense of this. But Jake didn't say anything. He just stared at their mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something else, something darker. Their mother took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in front of her. "I'm not going to pretend that this is normal," she said, her voice trembling now. "But I'm not going to punish you for it either. Because I understand. More than you know." Emma felt like she was going to pass out. Her head was spinning, her body trembling with a mix of fear and something else. Something she didn't want to name. She looked at Jake, silently pleading for him to say something, anything, to make sense of this. But Jake didn't say anything. He just stared at their mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something else, something darker. Their mother's gaze flicked between them, her expression unreadable. "You're not alone," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the only ones who've felt this way." Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. She could feel Jake's eyes on her, could sense his confusion, but she couldn't look at him. All she could do was stare at her mother, her heart pounding in her chest. Their mother reached out, her fingers brushing against Jake's cheek. The touch was soft, almost tender, but it made him flinch. "I've always known," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've always known how much you want her." Jake's jaw tightened, but He didn't pull away. He just stared at their mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something else, something darker. Their mother's hand lingered on his cheek for a moment longer before she let it drop. She turned to Emma, her expression softening even more. "Come here," she said softly, extending her hand. Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, what to think. Her mother's eyes were filled with something she didn't understand, something that made her heart race and her body tremble. But she couldn't move. She was frozen, trapped in a moment she didn't know how to escape. Their mother's expression softened even more, and she took a step closer. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you." Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she felt like she was going to pass out. Her head was spinning, her body trembling with a mix of fear and something else. Something she didn't want to name. She looked at Jake, silently pleading for him to say something, anything, to make sense of this. But Jake didn't say anything. He just stared at their mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something else. Something darker. "I've always known," their mother whispered, her voice trembling. "I've always known how much you want her." Emma's heart pounded so loudly she was sure her mother could hear it. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and forbidden desires. She glanced at Jake, searching his face for some kind of reassurance, but his expression was unreadable, dark, intense, and utterly still. Their mother's words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. What do you mean?" Emma finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling as much as her hands. She clutched the sheet tighter around her body, suddenly feeling exposed in a way she hadn't before. Their mother had always been strict, always watching. But this was something else entirely. Their mother took another step closer, her sharp features softening into something almost maternal, but with an edge that made Emma's stomach twist. "I've been where you are," she said quietly, her eyes flicking between Emma and Jake. "I know what it's like to want someone you shouldn't." Jake's jaw tightened, but he still didn't speak. His hand, resting on the bed beside Emma, clenched into a fist as he processed their mother's words. Emma could feel the tension radiating off him, but she couldn't tell if it was anger, fear, or something else entirely. "I'm not here to judge you," their mother continued, her voice low and steady now. I want you to be careful. This kind of thing, it changes you. It changes everything." Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Her mother wasn't supposed to know, no one was. This was supposed to be their secret, something just between her and Jake. But now it was out in the open, and there was no taking it back. Jake finally broke his silence, his voice low and rough. "What are you saying, Mom?" he asked, his tone cautious but firm. "Are you okay with this?" Their mother hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before she looked back up at them. "I don't know if okay is the right word," she admitted. "But I understand. And I'm not going to stop you. I want you to be smart about it." To protect each other. Emma's breath hitched, and she felt a strange mix of relief and dread wash over her. Relief that their mother wasn't going to punish them, wasn't going to tear them apart. But dread because now it was real. This wasn't just some secret fantasy they could pretend didn't exist. It was out there, acknowledged, and there was no going back. Jake's hand found hers under the sheet, his fingers intertwining with hers in a silent show of solidarity. His touch grounded her, reminding her that they were in this together, no matter what. "Mom," Emma started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you telling us this now?" Their mother sighed, her expression flickering with something Emma couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or longing. "Because I wish someone had told me," she said softly. "Back when I was in your position. It would have saved me a lot of pain." Emma felt a lump form in her throat, and she glanced at Jake again. His eyes were locked on their mother, his expression hard to read but intense. There was something in his gaze that made Emma's heart race, something that felt dangerous and thrilling all at once. Their mother took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders as if gathering her resolve. "I'm going to leave you two alone now," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something Emma couldn't quite identify. "Just be careful. And remember that I love you both." And with that, she turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, and Emma felt like she couldn't breathe. She looked at Jake, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in closer, his hand cupping her cheek as he searched her face. His touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine as she stared into his dark, intense eyes. "We do what we've always done," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "We take care of each other." Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a surge of heat flood her body. She knew what he meant. She could feel it in the way he was looking at her, in the way his thumb brushed softly against her cheek. The tension between them was palpable, crackling like a live wire. "But what if Mom's right?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if this changes everything?" Jake's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile, and he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin. "Maybe it already has," he murmured, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "But I'm not afraid of it. Are you?" Emma hesitated, her heart racing as she searched his eyes. She could see the desire there, the want, the need. And she knew he could see it in her too. She shook her head slowly, her voice trembling. "No," she whispered. "I'm not afraid." Jake's smile widened, and he leaned in, capturing her lips in a slow, searing kiss that left her breathless. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as the sheet slipped down around her, exposing her bare skin to the cool air of the room. Emma gasped against his mouth, her hands tangling in his hair as he deepened the kiss, his touch igniting a fire in her that she couldn't control. "Jake," she moaned softly, her body trembling with need as he moved his lips to her neck, nipping and sucking at her sensitive skin. "Sure," he murmured against her skin, his hands roaming her body as if he couldn't get enough of her. "I've got you, Emma."
I've always got you.
Emma's head fell back as he trailed kisses down her neck, her chest, her stomach. She felt like she was on fire, every touch, every kiss sending shockwaves of pleasure through her body. She gasped as his hands slid between her thighs, his fingers brushing against her most sensitive spot. "Jake, please," she begged, her voice trembling with desire. Jake looked up at her, his eyes dark with want as he spread her legs, his fingers teasing her as he leaned in. "Tell me what you want, Emma," he said, his voice low and rough. Emma's breath hitched, her body trembling with need as she stared into his eyes. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want you, Jake." Jake's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile, and he leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. "You've got me," he murmured, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "All of me." And with that, he lowered his mouth to her, his tongue flicking against her clit as his fingers pushed inside her, curling just right to make her cry out. Emma's hands fisted in the sheets, her back arching off the bed as pleasure coursed through her, overwhelming her senses. She could feel herself getting closer and closer to the edge, her body tightening with every movement of his tongue, every thrust of his fingers. "Jake, she gasped, her voice trembling as she felt the wave of pleasure building inside her. Jake didn't stop, his tongue and fingers working her in perfect harmony as he drove her closer and closer to the edge. And then, with a final, expert flick of his tongue, she was there, her body convulsing with pleasure as she cried out his name. "Jake," she moaned, her body trembling as the orgasm washed over her, leaving her breathless and boneless. Jake finally pulled back, his lips glistening as he looked up at her, his eyes dark with desire. "You're so beautiful when you come," he murmured, his voice low and rough. Emma's breath hitched, and she reached for him, pulling him up to her so she could kiss him deeply, her hands tangling in his hair as she poured all her emotions into the kiss. She could taste herself on his lips, and it only made her want him more. "Jake," she whispered against his lips, her voice trembling with need. "I need you." Jake's hands moved to her hips, his grip firm as he positioned himself at her entrance. "I'm here, Emma," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "I'm right here." And with that, he pushed inside her, his thick length filling her completely as he buried himself to the hilt. Emma gasped, her body trembling with pleasure as she wrapped her legs around his hips, pulling him closer. "Jake," she moaned, her hands clutching at his back as he began to move, his thrusts slow and deep. Jake's lips found hers again, his kiss passionate and demanding as he drove into her, his body moving in perfect harmony with hers. Emma could feel the pleasure building inside her again, her body tightening with every thrust as he pushed her closer and closer to the edge. "Jake, she gasped, her voice trembling as she felt the wave of pleasure building inside her. "Come for me, Emma." Jake growled against her lips, his thrusts growing faster, harder. "Let go." And she did, her body convulsing with pleasure as she cried out his name, her nails digging into his back as the orgasm washed over her. Jake followed her over the edge, his body shuddering as he spilled himself inside her, his name a whispered prayer on her lips. They stayed like that for a moment, their bodies still joined as they caught their breath, their hearts beating in sync. Jake finally pulled back, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, tender kiss. "I love you, Emma," he murmured, his voice low and rough. Emma's breath hitched, and she looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "I love you too, Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling with sincerity.